Seoul's most dangerous man had a secret he kept behind a locked mahogany door. Everyone in the estate knew that crossing that threshold was a death sentence. But the one woman who dared to enter wasn't looking for a paycheck. She was hunting for the sister who vanished under his watch. They called Lee Tae-sung a monster without a soul. But inside that forbidden room, the maid discovered something that proved everyone in the city, including her, was dead wrong. If you enjoy stories like this, then subscribe now, like, and comment to support the growth of my channel. Thank you. Back to the cinema. Enjoy. The third-floor hallway always smelled like expensive cologne and the kind of silence that feels heavy. Lee Tae-sung was a broad-shouldered ghost in a black tailored suit, an athletic shadow that ruled the underworld with a cold, angular jawline. He was away for a business dinner, leaving the house vulnerable for the first time in months. Neelam didn't look like a threat. With her deep brown complexion, almond-shaped eyes, and her hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun, she looked like just another part of the furniture. She stood before the cold brass handle of the study, the one place maids were warned never to touch. The rumors said the last person to walk inside never came back out. She didn't flinch. Her steady hands turned the lock, and she stepped into the one place she was told would be her grave. But as she entered, the dark myth of Lee Tae-sung shattered. The walls weren't lined with weapons or blood. Instead, the soft glow of high-tech monitors reflected in her dark eyes, revealing a digital graveyard of hundreds of missing women, including the girl in the faded photo tucked inside her apron. She was so focused on the screen that she didn't hear the footsteps. A shadow fell over her, tall and suffocating. Tae-sung was back early. He didn't reach for a gun or call security. He just stood there, his stern expression unreadable, and asked a single, quiet question. Did you find what you were looking for? The real mystery wasn't that she had broken his greatest rule. It was why a mafia boss was running a private war against the very darkness that stole her family. Neelam felt the air leave her lungs. The room, which had been freezing just a second ago, now felt stiflingly hot. She didn't turn around immediately. She couldn't. Her eyes were still locked on her sister's face on the monitor, a grainy image from a CCTV feed she had never seen before. Behind her, the floorboards didn't even creak, but she felt the sheer physical presence of Lee Tae-sung. He was a wall of muscle and expensive wool, blocking the only exit. The last girl who touched that keyboard is at the bottom of the Han River. His voice came, low and smooth like sliding silk. Is that the ending you wanted, Neelam? She finally turned, her back pressing against the desk. Tae-sung stood in the center of the room, his black dress shirt open at the collar, looking less like a man who had just come from a business dinner and more like a predator who had found a mouse in his territory. His deep-set eyes weren't angry, they were calculating. That was worse. Neelam's hand went to her apron pocket, her fingers brushing the worn edges of her sister's photograph. I'm not looking for an ending, she said, her voice trembling just enough for him to hear, but her chin stayed up. I'm looking for her, and you have her in a folder labeled, Product. Tae-sung took a step forward, the light from the screens catching the sharp, angular line of his jaw. He looked down at her, his height making her feel small, but he didn't raise a hand. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, and tapped a key on the board. The screen changed. The Product label vanished, replaced by a complex web of names, dates, and shipping routes. I don't keep girls in folders, Neelam. I track the people who do, he said, his gaze dropping to the photo peeking out of her pocket. The sternness in his face shifted for a split second, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition, or pain. You didn't come here to clean the floors. You came here to find a ghost. I came to find the man who took her, she spat, her fear momentarily replaced by the righteous heat of her hatred. And every road leads back to this house. To you. Tae-sung leaned in closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. Then you haven't been looking at the right roads, he whispered. He turned the monitor toward her, showing a name highlighted in red, one of his own top executives. If you want to kill me, do it later. But if you want to save her, you're going to have to stop being a maid and start being my eyes. Neelam stared at the screen, then back at the man the world called a monster. The silence between them stretched like a wire about to snap, leaving her with a choice that felt like its own kind of death sentence. Tae-sung didn't wait for her to process the shock. He turned back to the wall of monitors, his fingers moving across the keys with a speed that suggested he spent more time in this room than anywhere else in the mansion. "You think a man in my position just lets things happen?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "I built an empire on knowing exactly where every one and every gram goes. But 3 years ago, the numbers stopped adding up." He tapped a command, and the screen showing Neelam's sister shifted. It was replaced by a digital map of Seoul, pulsing with dozens of small, amber dots. "These are the ghosts," he said, gesturing to the screen. "Women, mostly, some younger than your sister. They vanish from bus stops, from outside convenience stores, even from their own doorsteps. And every single time a girl disappears, a shipment of legitimate electronics leaves one of my warehouses." Neelam moved closer, the blue light of the screens washing over her deep brown skin. She looked at the data points, the timestamps, and the logistics manifests. It was a masterpiece of hidden cruelty. "If you know it's happening, why haven't you stopped it?" she whispered, her eyes searching his face for a lie. Tae-sung's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck cording under the collar of his black suit. "Because the people running it are wearing my uniform," he admitted, the words sounding like they cost him something heavy. "They're using my trucks, my drivers, and my protection. It's a shadow syndicate living inside my own payroll like a parasite." He pulled up a final window, an organizational chart of his top lieutenants. 3 names were circled in red. "I've been hunting them from the inside for 2 years. I'm the one who gathered those files you found. I'm the one who's been tracking the money trails that the police are too scared to touch." Neelam felt the world tilt. She had spent months imagining the moment she would finally find the man responsible, but she never imagined he'd be the one standing next to her, sharing the same target. Tae-sung turned to face her fully, his broad shoulders blocking out the rest of the room. "I have the data, Neelam, but I don't have the eyes," he said, his gaze intense. "They expect me to be the boss. They watch every move I make. But they don't see the maid." He leaned in, his voice barely a breath. "Your sister is still in the city. I know which warehouse they're holding the next shipment in, but I need to know which of my men is going to be there to sign the papers." Neelam looked at the screen one last time, then at the photo of her sister. The fear was still there, but it was being crowded out by something sharper. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Tae-sung didn't smile, but the coldness in his eyes sparked with a new, dangerous purpose. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to clean the executive wing," he said. "And you're going to listen to everything." Neelam looked at the map of Seoul, the amber dots flickering like dying stars. For months, she had imagined Lee Tae-sung as the final boss in her sister's disappearance, a monster she would eventually have to break. But looking at the data on his screens, she realized she had been looking for a single person when she should have been looking for a network. She was a maid with a photograph and a grudge, he was a man with a private satellite feed and an army. Without him, she was just walking in circles in a city that swallowed girls whole. "Why me?" she asked, her voice finally finding its edge again. "You have security teams. You have hackers. Why involve the help?" Tae-sung stepped away from the monitors, the light catching the sharp, straight line of his nose. "Because my security teams are the ones being bribed, and my hackers are being watched," he said, his voice flat and honest. "You're the only person in this house with a reason to be loyal that money can't buy." He paused, his deep-set eyes searching hers. "I can give you the address where they're taking the next group. I can give you the name of the man who pushed your sister into that van. But I need to know which of my lieutenants is holding the pen." Neelam felt the weight of the choice. If she walked away now, she could go to the police, but she knew they were either too scared or too paid off to help. If she stayed, she was making a pact with the most feared Mafia boss in Korea. It was a deal with the devil, but the devil was the only one offering a way home. "I stay," she said, her hands clenching at her sides. "I'll be your eyes, but the moment I find her, I'm gone. And if I find out you're lying to me, I'll burn this entire command center to the ground with you inside it." Tae-sung didn't flinch at the threat. If anything, a ghost of respect crossed his stern expression. "Deal," he said quietly. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small, nearly invisible earpiece and a set of keys to the executive wing. "Tomorrow, the vice chairman is holding a private meeting. He likes his tea hot, and he likes his maids silent. Make sure you're both." As Neelam took the keys, the cold metal biting into her palm, she realized her life as a simple maid was officially over. She was a spy now, moving through a house full of wolves. And as she turned to leave the forbidden room, she couldn't help but notice one screen she hadn't seen before. A live feed of the very hallway she was about to enter, where a shadow was already waiting by the corner. The weight of the keys in Neelam's pocket felt like a lead weight as she pushed her cleaning cart down the long, silent corridor of the executive wing. She had walked this floor 100 times before, but today, every security camera felt like a staring eye. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of professional boredom. The look of a woman who saw only dust and fingerprints, not the men who ruled the city. She started with the office of Director Park, a man who treated the staff like invisible ghosts. As she entered, the scent of expensive leather and stale cigarette smoke hit her. She moved with practiced efficiency, spraying the mahogany desk and wiping it down in broad, rhythmic strokes. While her left hand polished the surface, her right hand reached into the underside of the heavy desk. With a small, satisfying click, the tiny transmitter Tae-sung had given her snapped into place behind the wooden trim. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She moved to the next office, then the next, her ears straining for the sound of footsteps on the plush carpet. In the vice chairman's suite, she knelt to scrub a scuff mark near the floor outlet, expertly sliding a second device into the narrow gap behind the baseboard. It was terrifyingly simple. To these men, she was just the help, a background character in the story of their lives. They didn't think she was capable of understanding their business, let alone dismantling it. By the time she reached the final office at the end of the hall, her apron was damp with cold sweat. She stepped inside, but the room wasn't empty. Minho, Tae-sung's most ambitious lieutenant, was standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the glass was sharp and predatory. Neelam froze, her hand hovering over the third bug hidden in her cleaning rag. "You're late today, Neelam," he said, his voice casual but laced with a needle-thin edge of suspicion. "The master's study took longer than usual, sir," she replied, keeping her head low, her almond-shaped eyes fixed on his polished black shoes. Minho turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over her slim frame, lingering just a second too long on her apron pocket. He took a slow step toward her, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like it might snap. Neelam held her breath, her fingers tightening around the rag. If he saw the bulge in her pocket, the pact with Tae-sung wouldn't just be over, it would be her death warrant. He stopped just inches away, the smell of his sharp cologne filling her lungs. "The master's study is forbidden," he whispered, leaning down so his breath brushed her ear. "I hope you didn't see anything you weren't supposed to." Neelam didn't breathe until the click of the door signaled Minho had finally left his office. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, but there was no time to shake. She had a job to do, and the silent maid act was the only shield she had left. She moved to the kitchenette, her hands steady as she prepared a tray of oolong tea. It was a routine she could do in her sleep, but today, the porcelain cups felt like they were made of thin ice. She carried the tray toward the private lounge where Minho and Director Park had ducked in for an unscheduled meeting. As she approached, she didn't knock, she simply slipped inside with the quiet, invisible grace Tae-sung had relied on. The two men were huddled near the window, their voices low, but the bugs she'd planted earlier were already live and feeding audio back to the command center. "The shipment at the docks is set for 0400, Minho said, his voice stripped of the casual tone he'd used with her in the hallway. "The master thinks he's tracking a rogue cell. He has no idea the call is coming from inside the house." Director Park let out a short, dry laugh. "Tae-sung is obsessed with his ghosts. He's so busy looking for missing girls that he's missed the fact that his own logistics leads are the ones signing the manifests." Neelam's hand trembled slightly as she set a cup down, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. Both men froze. Min-ho turned, his deep-set eyes narrowing as they landed on her. For a heartbeat, she was sure he could hear her heart thudding. "More tea, sir?" she asked, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the floor just as Tae-sung had coached her. Min-ho stared at her for a long, suffocating moment before waving her off with a flick of his wrist. "Get out." She backed out of the room, her head bowed, but her mind was racing. It wasn't just a rogue lieutenant. The betrayal reached right into the core of Tae-sung's inner circle. As soon as she reached the service stairs, she pressed the hidden comms link in her ear. "They're moving tonight," she whispered, her voice tight with a mix of fear and cold determination. "And it's not just Min-ho. They're all in on it." The line was silent for a second before Tae-sung's gravelly voice came through. "Get to the safe room. The gala starts in 2 hours, and we're changing the plan." Neelam realized then that the business dinner Tae-sung had mentioned wasn't just a meeting, it was a trap. And she was the only one who could walk into it without being spotted. Neelam didn't have time to process the fear. 2 hours later, the white apron and black uniform were a heap on the floor of a hidden dressing room, replaced by a deep emerald silk gown that felt like a second skin. It was Tae-sung's choice. He told her the color would make her skin glow under the chandeliers, making her look like royalty instead of a servant. When she stepped out, she didn't see a maid in the mirror. She saw a woman who could hold the attention of every man in the room, which was exactly the point. "Don't look at the cameras," Tae-sung's voice whispered in her ear through the tiny transmitter. "Look at the guests. Look for the silver briefcase. Min-ho won't hand it over in a dark alley. He'll do it in the middle of the crowd where everyone is too busy being polite to notice a crime." The gala was a blur of champagne, classical music, and fake smiles. Neelam moved through the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt, her heart a frantic drum beneath the silk. She felt exposed without her cleaning cart, but she realized Tae-sung was right. In a room full of people trying to be seen, she was still invisible in a different way. She was just another beautiful face in a sea of them. She spotted Min-ho near the balcony, looking sharp in a tuxedo that cost more than she made in a year. He was laughing with a group of investors, his hand resting casually on the railing. Next to him, a man she didn't recognize was holding a slim, silver case. Neelam took a deep breath, took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and began to weave through the crowd. "I'm moving in," she whispered into her collar. "Wait," Tae-sung's voice came back, sharper now. "Director Park just entered from the West Wing. He's headed straight for you. Neelam, he saw your face in the lounge. Turn around." But it was too late. Park's eyes locked onto hers from across the floor. The recognition was instant. He didn't look confused, he looked murderous. He reached into his jacket, not for a phone, but for something heavier. Neelam didn't turn back. She lunged forward, intentionally stumbling into the man with the briefcase. Champagne splashed across the silver surface. As she reached out to steady herself, her fingers brushed the handle of the case, and she felt a small, hard object taped to the bottom. She swiped it in one fluid motion, tucking it into the folds of her dress just as a heavy hand slammed onto her shoulder. "You're a long way from the executive wing, Neelam," Director Park hissed in her ear. She turned to see the glint of a silenced barrel peeking out from beneath his sleeve. "Where's the master? Or did he send you here to die for him?" Neelam felt the cold press of the gun barrel against her ribs through the thin silk of her dress. Director Park's grip on her shoulder was like an iron vice. Just as he began to steer her toward the darkened balcony, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open. Lee Tae-sung walked in. He wasn't the master tonight. He looked like an executioner. He moved through the crowd of socialites, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the sea of tuxedos. He didn't look at the champagne or the guests. His deep-set eyes were fixed entirely on Director Park and the hand he had on Neelam. The music didn't stop, but the air in the room died. Min-ho and 3 other lieutenants, men Tae-sung had called brothers for a decade, stepped away from the bar. They didn't move to stand behind their boss. Instead, they formed a semicircle, effectively trapping Tae-sung between the elite crowd and the marble balcony. You're out of your element, Tae-sung, Minho said, his voice carrying over the violin quartet. He didn't look afraid anymore. He looked bored. You spent so much time looking into the dark for ghosts that you forgot to watch the men standing in the light right next to you. Tae-sung stopped 5 feet away. He ignored the guns being adjusted under jackets. He looked at Neelam, his expression stern but his eyes signaling her to stay still. I didn't forget, Minho. I just wanted to see how much my loyalty was worth to you. Apparently, it's the price of a few shipping containers. It's the price of an empire, Director Park hissed, shoving Neelam forward so she stumbled toward Tae-sung. In that heartbeat, the betrayal went from quiet whispers to cold steel. All 4 lieutenants pulled their weapons. The high society guests began to scream, scattering like birds as the brothers turned their guns on the man who had built them. Tae-sung stood alone in the center of the floor, his hands empty, his posture unshakable. You think you can lead them? Tae-sung asked, his voice low and dangerous. They don't follow you because they respect you. They follow you because they think I'm dead. But I'm still standing. Not for long, Minho replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. Neelam reached into the folds of her dress, her fingers locking around the drive she had swiped. She saw the red dot of a laser sight settle on Tae-sung's chest. Just as Minho prepared to fire, the heavy chandeliers above them flickered and died, plunging the ballroom into total, suffocating darkness. Run! Tae-sung's voice roared through the blackness, but it wasn't followed by a gunshot. It was followed by the sound of a heavy door being kicked in and the shattering of glass. Neelam scrambled toward the sound of his voice, but a hand grabbed her hair in the dark, yanking her backward. The girl comes with us, a voice growled. She's the only leverage we have left. Neelam didn't wait to see who had grabbed her. She drove her heel into the man's shin and twisted with a strength she didn't know she had. As his grip loosened, a flashlight beam cut through the dark, and she saw Tae-sung. He wasn't running for the exit, he was heading for her. He grabbed her hand, his palm rough and warm, and pulled her toward the service stairs. They aren't just trying to kill us, he grunted as they sprinted up the steps, the sounds of chaos echoing below. They're going for the evidence. They're going for the room. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, the smell of smoke was already thick. Neelam's heart sank. She saw the heavy mahogany door to the forbidden room standing wide open. Inside, orange light flickered against the walls. Minho's men hadn't just broken in, they had tossed a thermite charge onto the servers. The high-tech command center, the map of the ghosts, and the files on her sister were melting into a heap of glowing plastic and wire. No, Neelam screamed, lunging toward the fire. The data, it's the only way to find them. Tae-sung caught her around the waist, pulling her back just as a monitor screen exploded, sending glass flying across the room. It's gone, Neelam. We have to move. The heat was becoming unbearable, the expensive wallpaper curling and blackening in seconds. The traitors had played their final card. If they couldn't control the empire, they would burn the proof of their crimes. As the ceiling began to groan, Tae-sung steered her toward the private elevator behind the desk, but the power hummed and died. They were trapped on the 3rd floor of a burning fortress with an army of killers coming up the stairs. Neelam looked at the fire, tears of frustration and smoke stinging her eyes. Everything they had worked for was turning to ash. But then she felt the small, hard drive still tucked against her ribs. She looked at Tae-sung, who was scanning the room for a way out, his face etched with a grim, athletic focus. I have the handoff data, she whispered over the roar of the flames. But we won't live to use it if we stay here. Tae-sung looked at the window, then at her. He didn't ask if she was ready. He grabbed a heavy chair, smashed the reinforced glass, and the night air rushed in, feeding the fire into a frenzy. Below them, the docks were a dark smudge in the distance, and the sound of sirens began to wail. Trust me, he said, holding out his hand. Behind them, the door kicked open, and the first of the traitors stepped through the smoke, his gun leveled at Tae-sung's head. The jump from the 3rd-story window was a blur of freezing air and a bone-jarring impact onto the roof of a parked SUV, but they didn't stop to check for broken ribs. Tae-sung drove like a man with nothing left to lose, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as the burning mansion receded in the rearview mirror. Neelam sat beside him, her emerald dress torn and stained with soot, her hand pressed hard against the drive in her pocket. "We're running out of time," Tae-sung said, his voice a low growl. "If that ship leaves the pier, the paper trail dies with the fire back at the house." By the time they reached the Incheon docks, the sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of a cold dawn creeping over the horizon. The salt air was thick and heavy, smelling of rusted metal and diesel. Tae-sung killed the lights a block away, gliding the car into the shadow of a row of shipping containers. Neelam stepped out, her eyes scanning the crane-lined horizon. "There," she whispered, pointing toward Pier 7. A massive, rusted freighter sat low in the water, its engines already humming with a deep, rhythmic thrum that shook the ground. Men in dark tactical gear, the same men who had been on Tae-sung's payroll yesterday, were moving quickly, ushering a line of hooded figures toward the gangplank. Tae-sung handed Neelam a pair of binoculars. As she dialed the focus, her breath hitched. Through the shaky lenses, she saw a girl in a tattered denim jacket. She was thin, her head bowed, but the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear was unmistakable. "Maya," Neelam breathed, her voice cracking. Her sister was less than 50 yards away, being shoved toward the dark maw of the ship. The sight of her, so close yet separated by a line of armed traitors, sent a surge of adrenaline through Neelam that washed away the exhaustion. "They're moving the final group," Tae-sung said, checking the magazine of the handgun he'd pulled from the glove box. "Once those doors close, that ship becomes a ghost. No flag, no GPS, no way to track it." Neelam looked at the ship, then at the man beside her. The broad-shouldered boss looked tired, but his eyes were fixed on the cargo with a look of pure, focused rage. "How do we stop a ship that size?" Neelam asked, her eyes moving from the gangplank to the thick steel cables mooring the vessel to the dock. Tae-sung looked at her, a grim, knowing shadow of a smile touching his lips. "We don't stop the ship from the outside. We go to the heart of it." But as they stepped out from the shadows, a spotlight snapped on, blinding them both. The sound of a dozen heavy boots hitting the pavement echoed through the pier. Minho stepped into the light, a smug grin on his face. "I figured you'd come for the girl, Tae-sung. It's a shame you brought the help to a gunfight." The blinding light of the spotlight outside had been a distraction, but in the belly of the ship, the only light was the rhythmic pulsing of the engine room's emergency reds. Neelam didn't wait for the ship to pull away. She knew that once those massive propellers started churning the harbor water, Maya was gone forever. While Minho was outside, busy savoring what he thought was the final moment of Lee Tae-sung, he made the one mistake the boss had warned her about. He stopped looking at the background. To him, Neelam was just a maid in a torn dress, a piece of furniture that had somehow moved. But Tae-sung had spent the last few nights teaching her more than just how to plant bugs. He had shown her the throat of his fleet. Neelam scrambled over the grease-slicked metal catwalks, her breathing shallow and hot. The roar of the diesel engines was a physical weight, shaking her teeth in her gums. She reached the secondary fuel intake manifold, the lifeblood of the freighter. Tae-sung's voice echoed in her head, calm and steady. "You don't need to blow a ship up to kill it. You just need to make it choke." She pulled a heavy, rusted wrench from her waistband, the one she'd swiped from the car's emergency kit. With a grunt of effort, she slammed it into the glass sediment bulb of the primary fuel line. It shattered, spraying foul-smelling oil across her emerald silk gown. The engine's rhythm immediately changed. The deep, healthy thrum turned into a violent, metallic coughing. The ship groaned. The vibration became a shuddering earthquake that threw Neelam against the steel railing. Warning sirens began to scream, piercing through the mechanical thunder. Below her, the massive pistons slowed, struggled, and finally seized with a sound like a mountain collapsing. The lights overhead flickered once and died, plunging the engine room into a terrifying, oily silence. Neelam stood in the dark, her hands shaking and covered in black sludge. She had done it. She had turned the most powerful tool in the trafficker's arsenal into a floating cage. But the silence didn't last. Above her, the heavy steel hatch was kicked open, and the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the smoke. You really think a little grease on your hands makes you a hero? Min-ho's voice drifted down the stairs, dripping with a cold, jagged rage. He didn't sound like a businessman anymore. He sounded like a man who was ready to watch the world burn. Neelam backed away into the shadows of the dead machinery, her heart hammering. She was trapped in the dark with a killer, and the only man who could save her was still pinned down on the docks. As Min-ho's boots began to clang down the metal steps, she realized the fight for her sister's life was only just beginning. The silence that followed the chaos at the docks was almost louder than the sirens. The freighter sat dead in the water, a massive steel tomb for Min-ho's ambitions. In the end, it wasn't a bullet that finished him, but the simple fact that he had nowhere left to run. Tae-sung's men, the ones who hadn't traded their loyalty for a bribe, had swarmed the pier the moment the engines died. Neelam stood on the concrete edge of the dock, her emerald dress ruined, her face smeared with grease and salt. Her hands were still shaking, but the chill of the morning air didn't reach her. Not when she saw the small, familiar figure climbing down the gangplank. Maya looked smaller than Neelam remembered, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and disbelief. When their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. Neelam didn't run. She stumbled forward, catching her sister in a hug so tight it felt like she was trying to fuse them back together. Tae-sung stood a few paces away. He looked different in the gray light of dawn. The immortal boss looked human. His black suit was torn, and there was a dark bruise forming along his angular jaw, but his posture was as straight as ever. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched them, a man who had spent years hunting ghosts finally seeing one come back to life. 6 months later, the Lee estate didn't smell like old secrets and heavy silence anymore. The third floor had been rebuilt, but the forbidden room was gone. In its place was a bright, open office with windows that actually let the sun in. Neelam walked down the hallway, her boots clicking softly on the polished wood. She wasn't wearing a white apron or a low bun today. Her hair was out, and she wore a sharp, tailored blazer that matched the steady confidence in her eyes. She entered the office where Tae-sung was standing by the window, looking out at a city that was slowly becoming cleaner, one dismantled shipment at a time. He turned, a faint, rare smile touching his lips when he saw her. He didn't sit behind the desk. Instead, he pulled out a chair at the long conference table and gestured for her to sit at the head of it. The board is waiting for the report on the new logistics network, he said, his voice warm. They're still nervous about a woman running the oversight committee. Neelam sat down, placing her tablet on the table, the same table where men used to whisper about succession. They'll get used to it, she replied. I've spent enough time cleaning up after them. It's time I started telling them where the mess is. Tae-sung leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. I'm not asking you to stay because I need a partner, Neelam. I'm asking because you're the only one who sees the people behind the numbers. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, silver key on the table. It wasn't to a study or a vault. It was to the entire organization. No more uniforms. No more shadows. You have a seat at this table for as long as you want it. Neelam looked at the key, then at the man who had gone from her greatest fear to her greatest ally. She thought of Maya, safe at home, and the hundreds of other sisters who were no longer just dots on a map. She picked up the key. Good, she said, her voice echoing with a new kind of power. Because we have a lot of work to do.